Hey everybody, I'm Scott Henson from Dallas Baptist Church. I want to share a few words with you today about women in the life of Paul. We're continuing our study on Wednesday tonight about Paul in Philippi and Thessalonica. We're still doing the Ray Vander Laan study on Clash of Kingdoms. And one of the things that Vander Laan highlights in the story is a story of some lady named Lydia. She's a dyer of purple. She pops up in a story over in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 16. In fact, she pops up at verse 13, and they get to the city of Philippi, Paul and his traveling party, which is a Roman colony, by the way. Anyway, it says, on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate of the river, or to the river. We expect to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. They spoke to the women. Important. Some of the synagogues, Jewish synagogues that day, women, especially in less predominantly Gentile areas, or Jewish areas, women were very important to the life of the synagogue. And of course, where does Paul go first? He goes to his Jewish brothers and sisters, or the God-fearers, those who were Gentile but followed the God of Abraham. Paul will go there first and evangelize. But anyway, synagogues were held together by women. Early churches, in many ways, we'll look here in just a moment, were held together by women. And even today, in a lot of churches, the women do a lot of the work. And as that country song said a few years ago, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. It's true. Without the hardworking women, a lot of churches, especially, I know in my experience in Baptist life, without the hardworking women, the Baptist churches would fall apart. Churches in general would. And sadly, though, a lot of denominations don't give a lot of women a lot of say. And it breaks my heart, because we find in the New Testament a lot of the women had places of prominence. But anyway, let's go back to Lydia, and we'll talk about some more stuff here in just a moment. But Lydia is a dyer of purple. Here it says that they began to speak to the women in verse 14. And one of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. Now, dealer in purple cloth meant she was a pretty important businesswoman. She was probably worth a good bit of money. You had to have a special permission to be a dealer of purple cloth, because purple cloth, purple was the color of the emperor, color was the purple of the upper crust. It was very expensive. To be in that position, she was not the Bill Gates of her era, but she was a CEO type of her era. I mean, she was an important lady in the area. Lydia was. And it says that she was a worshiper of God. She was a God-fearer. She was a Gentile who worshipped the God of Abraham. She wasn't Jewish. She didn't necessarily convert, but they still worshipped. And we find God-fearers throughout the New Testament especially. It says, Lord had opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. And verse 15 says, and when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us into her home. I guess the us here, Luke's probably with Paul at this point. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house, and she persuaded us. So Paul runs into some women there at Philippi. We find also in the letter to the Philippians, there's some other women who take a prominent role in the church that Paul establishes in Philippi. Euodia and Syntyche, we find that they had apparently, these women, they were important, and they were Paul's co-laborers, and they struggled beside Paul in the work of the gospel, Paul writes in Philippians 2:3. But apparently they were having a struggle. They were fighting. They were bickering. But nonetheless, these two women seem to be important in the life of the early church at Philippi. So women played an important part. We get over into the book of Romans, and there's several women mentioned in Romans 16. They're of importance. Paul kind of gives a list of people he wants to thank and to mention and encourage. And one of them, in Romans chapter 16, says, I'm introducing our sister Phoebe to you, who is a deacon. A lot of the translations translate as deacon, some translate as servant. We don't know necessarily what that word deacon meant in the context to which Paul was writing. A lot of scholars even say that maybe think she was a servant of the church. Some think that maybe that deacon was actually a technical term, where she had administrative responsibility. She was a leader in the early church, not necessarily a deacon like in a Baptist context, maybe, a lay leader, or it could have been even a deacon like in some other denominations. I know, and I have some friends who are Methodist who are deacons. It's a non-ordained clergy position. A little different than our lay position in Baptist life, but regardless, she was of some importance, and she had some role, seemed to be in that church, or at least be in that church. But you go on down to verse 3 and following, and there's several other women who are mentioned here. In fact, Paul mentions more men, twice as many men as women, but he commends more than twice as many women as men. In Romans chapter 3 through 16, he mentions Prisca and Aquila, or Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla's the wife, and it's funny how the wife is mentioned first. And most times you see Priscilla and Aquila, it is Priscilla, the wife, first, then the husband. They play a very important role over in Acts and Paul's ministry. We also find in verse 6, Paul writes in Romans 16:6, say hello to Mary, who has worked very hard for you, another woman. Now I get down to verse 7, there's some controversy with these names here, but it says, say hello to Andronicus and Eunia. You may want to pronounce that J like a J instead of the Y sound. The Greek has the Y sound, Eunia. My relatives and fellow prisoners, they are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. They were prominent among the apostles. So Andronicus is definitely a male name in the Latin ending, the us ending. Eunia is a female name. Female name. So scholars have debated. Some have wanted to say that Eunia here is maybe a misspelling. They want to put Eunice, but that is not necessarily supported. The text does read, in most cases, most copies of the manuscripts, Eunia. So maybe a female apostle? That's crazy, isn't it? But if you think about it, in the life of Jesus, a lot of the women who played prominent roles, the Marys, Martha, these were women. It wasn't just the men. The women were important and vital to Jesus' ministry on earth. And they were vital to Paul's ministry. And you go on the list, and there's even Romans 16:12 here, Tryphenia and Tryphosa. There are women here. Now again, there's twice as many men as women in the list in Romans 16, but twice as many women are commended as opposed to men. So this is all the ladies. You are important and vital to the life of a church. You are important and vital to God's community. And I want to thank you. I want to thank all those ladies that took an interest in me and invested in me growing up at Pearl Baptist Church in Iron Station, North Carolina. I want to thank all those ladies in my prior churches who have invested in the life of their church and the life of me as minister, or as youth pastor in some cases. You are very important. You are vital. You may not be a deacon like Phoebe. You may not be an apostle like Eunia. You may not be a rich person like Lydia, but you are important, and your work may go unnoticed, and you may not have much input, but God sees it, and thank you for that. So ladies, you are vital. Men, we need to realize that these women are very important, and that without the women, most churches would fall apart. So we need to thank our ladies, recognize them, give them a say, because you know what? God can use them. I had a retired minister in my first church I served. I was still in seminary divinity school, and the minister kind of took me under his wing, and he mentored me. He was a member of the church. He'd grown up in that church and come back after retirement, and he often would remind me. He says, if God can use Balaam's donkey, God can use a woman. Now, of course, he didn't necessarily mean that as bad as it sounds. He was trying to be positive. It sounds kind of rough, doesn't it? But God can use women. So God can use women for his ministry. So don't feel like you're second class or inferior. And some churches make women feel that way, But you're important. Mary, Eunia, Tryphenia, Tryphosa, Euodia, Synecdoche, Phoebe, Lydia, Mary, Martha, Mary Magdalene. Women, you're important. And thank you for all you do. And may God bless you and keep you and guide you.